Americans For Fair Taxation presents the weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans For Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, November 18th, 2022. Today's Chairman's Report is guest written by Jade Walle. Jade's a partner of a CPA firm and is on the board of Americans For Fair Taxation. Math is apparently complex. The fair tax is not. In the weeks and even months prior to Election Day, as well as on Tuesday, November 8th, Americans went to the polls and exercised their precious right to vote in our midterm elections. Now, for many decades, the results of our country's elections were expeditiously tabulated on Election Day. Precinct by precinct, voting totals were reported to the state for public dissemination, and before the night was done, everyone knew who won and who lost. In the past two election cycles, however, it appears that our ability to count, primarily the application of addition and summation, has been significantly degraded. Now, of course, certain jurisdictions appear to have more difficulty than others, but the overall degradation of the system raises the question of complexity versus simplicity. In days past, except for a relatively small number of absentees, everyone showed up at the polls and voted on Election Day. Now there are multiple new ways to vote, collect votes, and verify votes. Supporters of these new extensions argue that it makes the process easier and encourages more participation. But all this added complexity comes at a cost. It now takes weeks or even months to get the final results. The idea of complexity versus simplicity also applies to one of our government's largest and most complex enterprises, our system of taxation. On one hand, we have the incredibly complex income payroll tax system. Now, the simple alternative we read about today is the FAIRtax. As we consider complexity versus simplicity, let's examine what our brilliant thinkers of the past had to say on the matter. Occam's razor is represented by a famous Latin phrase that reads, pluralitas non est poneta sine necessitate. Now, this translates to, plurality should not be posited without necessity. Now, simplifying that further into more modern English, the simplest explanation is usually the best one, or entities should not be multiplied needlessly. Truer words were never spoken. While Occam's razor is not a principle of absolute truth, it is certainly a well thought out guiding heuristic that is founded in wisdom and can be of great benefit to us. So, following Occam's razor, which system of taxation is simpler? Now, even those employed in professions a million miles away from accounting and taxation can readily answer that question, but let's examine a few facts and let you, the listener, much like our U.S. voters, decide on the matter. Let's look at the income payroll tax. U.S. taxpayers spend over $300 billion and 6.5 billion hours per year complying with the income tax. Americans file nearly 300 million tax returns with the IRS every year. The payroll tax is regressive. It's the largest tax paid by the majority of Americans. The income tax strips away many protections that are outlined in our Bill of Rights, including the protection against self-incrimination, the right to a trial by jury, the protection from illegal search and seizure, and free speech, among others. The IRS's annual budget, prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, nearly $14 billion. The U.S. is one of only two countries in the world that taxes its citizens' worldwide income. Americans living outside the country must pay U.S. income taxes, interest, and capital gains taxes, in addition to the income taxes levied by their host country. Embedded taxes of about 10 to 25% are ingrained within the retail prices of every product and service we purchase today. It's nearly impossible to contact the IRS for help with basic questions, and those fortunate enough to get through don't always get accurate answers. The income tax constantly changes and is one of the most heavily lobbied areas in D.C. Over 75,000 pages of statutes, rules, and regulations comprise our income tax code, and over 200 million individuals and companies have to act as tax collectors and receive nothing for their efforts. Now let's look at the FAIRtax. It was founded on the principle of simplicity. With a fair tax, there's no IRS, no income tax returns, meaning that 6.5 billion hours and over $300 billion a year would be saved. With a fair tax, you keep your entire paycheck. No federal withholding, no federal payroll taxes. With a fair tax, you don't pay taxes on life's basic necessities. Every legal household receives a prebate every month to reimburse them for the taxes paid on their spending up to the poverty level. The fair tax is more progressive and thus more fair to America's working poor. Businesses don't pay the fair tax on their business-to-business purchases. Only retailers charge and collect the fair tax from their retail customers. With a fair tax, there's no income tax, no gift tax, no alternative minimum tax, and no death tax for individuals or businesses. The fair tax is paid once and only once on the initial retail purchase of new goods and services. Those embedded taxes we talked about earlier, 10 to 25% of the retail prices we're paying today, all fall out of the cost of those retail purchases. There are only a little over 100 pages of fair tax legislative language, that's H.R. 25, and retailers in states retain 0.25% of the collections they make as payment for their tax collection services. Now, assuming our federal government not only has room to improve its general operations, management, oversight, administration, federal election guidelines, and legislative and rulemaking processes, but also has room to improve its tax collection system, which of the two alternatives above would we choose if we were to follow the principle of Occam's razor as described above? Rhetorical questions are usually the best, as the logic displayed makes contemplating the alternative choice laughable. Unfortunately, our current taxation system does not follow Occam's razor, but rather Hickham's dictum, which hypothesized that patients might have multiple complex symptoms and diseases. Now, although these competing pearls of wisdom emanated from the medical profession centuries ago, the scientific community relishes Occam's razor and finds its wisdom essential to scientific advancement and problem solving. So, if we could remove all the noise, the lobbyists, the campaign contribution cycle and system, the political class warfare embodied in the income tax code, and the hamster wheel feeling of inertia that our income tax system embodies for us, and if we could start fresh from day one, which taxation system would you vote for? In conclusion, what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives demanding that if the government really wants to eliminate the burden of filing income tax returns, they should enact the fair tax and do away with income tax returns altogether. The great 18th century Irish statesman Edmund Burke made a statement that applies in many ways. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. Remember, if we don't continue to tell the truth and demand a change, then this quote from George Orwell's 1984 may foretell our children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Take back control. Help us pass the fair tax. The IRS will be gone and we'll pay our taxes when we make purchases. We, not the ruling class and their minions in D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay. If you have friends who don't know about the fair tax, send them to fairtax.org. Have them watch the whiteboards under how it works, and if they agree, ask them to please join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the fair tax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans For Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.